What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel here from Stack Strength, and today I'm going to talk about how you can progress your squat, bench, and deadlift. Now, I'm going to give you guys specific tactics. We're talking reps, sets, intensities, different strategies and tactics so that you can apply specifically to your training, start seeing better results in your progression of each of these lifts. Now, before we get into that, we are going to cover a little bit of kind of theory and some really important concepts to understand. Now, the reason why we're doing this is not just to talk for the sake of talking, but it's really important to understand some of the concepts and some of the fundamentals that are going to drive your decisions in programming. Okay, so this is very, very important. It's going to give you a little bit more accuracy and precision in terms of how you integrate some of these strategies into your own program. All right, going to give you a little bit better application. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about are some bottlenecks in performance. Okay, now before I really look at someone's program, before I really start to tinker around with the program, I always will make sure that an athlete is checking off all of these boxes, okay? Because if they're not checking off these boxes, no amount of program design, change, or tactics or anything is really gonna make a difference. We need to make sure that we're doing a really good job with all of these things first if we really wanna see progressions in the squat, bench, and deadlift for powerlifting. So the first thing that we're gonna look at is something called directed adaptation. Basically what this means is that training has to be specific to the desired outcome. Now, an easy example to understand is if you want to get better at boxing, playing ice hockey is not going to help you. Now, people can understand that fairly easily, but then when we start talking about weightlifting, it becomes a little bit more nebulous because let's say we have two different people. One person is doing, a couple sets of doubles for squat on low bar. The other person's doing, 3 sets of 8 to 10 on high bar. They're both squats. They're both pretty damn similar in terms of the execution, but one is going to be directed a lot more towards one outcome and the other is going to be directed towards another outcome. Now, yes, there is going to be some overlap for sure, right? If we're just talking about purely strength and purely hypertrophy. However, they are very distinctly different, and how you program them is going to ultimately affect your results and your progress. Especially if we're doing really high reps, that's going to affect your ability to express strength in a 1-rep max. So we need to make sure that the training is specific to what it is that we're trying to accomplish. If we're trying to increase our 1-rep max, are we doing sets of 10 to 15 on the squat? That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And conversely, if your objective is to get as jacked as humanly possible, doing like triples and maxing out on your squat isn't going to be very effective for building muscle. So we need to make sure the exercises that we choose, the reps, the intensity, all of that stuff is serving the long-term goal of making you the best and the strongest power lifter possible. And that's really important to understand. We can't be thinking in short term. We have to think about long-term development of your athletic ability. So again, if you're 6 foot and 150 pounds, man, yeah, you do need to train for strength, but you need to put on a ton of freaking weight. So you're probably gonna have a lot more hypertrophy training in your program than someone else who's already, very jacked for their frame, right? So it's not just a one size fits all. You need to understand what kind of outcomes that you want to accomplish is going to make you the best lifter. Next, we need to look at a needs analysis. And this kind of piggybacks on what I was talking about a moment ago. We need to understand what the bottlenecks in performance are. Do you lack sufficient muscle mass based on your frame? Do you lack technical ability? Do you lack bracing ability? Is it legitimately just a strength issue? Like everything looks perfect, but you're just not very strong and we need more intensity? Do we need more volume? What kind of exercises have the highest transference for you? What exercises don't seem to do a whole lot? Because if we look at, let's say, a lifter like Dan Green gets a ton out of front squats and he does a lot of them. I also get a lot out of front squats, but I do have some athletes who don't really get a whole lot out of front squats, but get tons out of an SSB squat, right? So you really have to think about what are the needs of the individual. And if you're coaching yourself, if you're working and developing your own program, you need to really look at that and say, okay, what do I need as a lifter? How am I going to get better? What am I going to need in order to drive the adaptations that are going to have the most significant impact on my 1-rep max? So these things collectively all kind of form that picture that inform what type of progression strategies, what exercises, what amounts of volume, how much exposure to intensity you need in order to direct you in the right way. Next, we want to make sure that the goal is performance, not feeling like you had a good workout. And the reason why I say that is because there are many times where I had take an athlete on and I'll give them training. Like I'll review their previous training. We'll do a very in-depth needs analysis. We'll look at their biomechanics of the lift and their execution, and then I'll write them their program. And they do the program and they come back and they're like, hey, I like the program, but I don't really feel that tired afterwards. Like I don't feel like I'm really exhausted afterwards. And I always ask them, like, well, is the goal to feel exhausted or is the goal to get stronger? And they're like, well, no, I want to get stronger, but I'm just not sure if we're doing enough. I'm not sure if we're working hard enough, like because of the amount of volume that we're doing is usually a little bit lower than what they're used to. And I always just tell them to wait. I'm like, just wait. As we continue moving forward, you're going to notice that you're going to get a whole lot stronger, but you're going to feel fresher between sessions because I don't want my athletes going into sessions feeling really banged up. I want them feeling recovered. I want them feeling fresh so they can execute their training really effectively. Now, I want to be very clear. That does not mean that they don't work super fucking hard. The level of intensity of effort that they put in is really fucking high. But again, intensity of effort is going to be relative to what you're used to. So for instance, a marathon runner might not find it very hard to do a bunch of training to absolute failure because they're just used to pushing that hard all the time. But you get them to do 1 rep max and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, this is so heavy, I can't do it. They can't coordinate. So that might seem really heavy to them. So it really just depends on what it is that you're used to in your training and how you're adapting to barbell specific training or different exercises or volumes and things like that. So intensity of effort does always have to be really high. However, you don't necessarily want to feel banged up and run down all the time. You should be feeling fresh for subsequent training sessions. The next thing is intensity of effort. This is kind of what I was alluding to just a moment ago. You want the intensity of effort being very, very high. So in addition to athletes coming to me and being like, hey, this isn't enough volume. Like normally I do way more volume. One of the reasons why they're doing more volume is because their intensity of effort is not very high. They're not pushing as hard as they need to. And so in order to counteract that lack of intensity, they need to do more volume to make up for that. So one of the things that I do with a lot of my lifters is I'll pull back the volume, but get them pushing the intensity much, much higher. So I'll get a lifter submitting a video and I look at it and I'm like, no, that's not a true RPE 8. That's more like a 7 or something like that. And I'll really have them fucking push. So when they're training based on their intensities and based on their reps and their sets, they're actually hitting those targets. It's very, very hard to do an RPE 8 or an RPE 7. Those are very hard lifts. So if you're really pushing at that intensity, it should be incredibly difficult. Now, if you're really pushing hard, that also means that we can back off on some of the volume because we're getting a really great stimulus per set. So we're getting a better stimulus per set, which means we need to do less sets to get more effective reps, so to speak. Now, the effective reps model is something a little bit different. We're not going to go too deep into that. However, it is something that's pretty important, I think, anyways, as a concept. I don't think that you necessarily have to count out, okay, I got 3 or 5 or 6 effective reps. I don't think it works like that. I think that it does work, however, as a concept. What is the quality of sets that I'm getting? How hard am I pushing? How much effort am I putting into these sets, and how much output am I getting from them? So I think as a concept, it's very important. And intensity of effort has to be very, very high. If it's not there, then you're just going to have to make up by doing a whole lot more volume, which ends up being a little bit more fatiguing, a little bit more wear and tear on the joints. And it's just not as efficient in terms of utilization of time management, in my opinion, either. The next is the stimulus to fatigue ratio. So again, this kind of comes back to some of the other things we already talked about. So we want to make sure that our output is incredibly high. If we have high intensity of effort, very high output, that means we need to do less volume. And in fact, we can actually tolerate less volume because our intensity of effort is very, very high. So if we have high intensity, then we need to scale back the volume accordingly. So we need to make sure that, again, we remember we are training for strength. Strength is primarily driven by neurological adaptations. We need to be lifting heavy and we need to be doing it often. But we need to make sure that we're not lifting too heavy too often, or else we start accumulating fatigue faster than we're accumulating strength. So there's kind of a fine balance between fatigue and fitness, and fatigue and strength development. And that's kind of that balance of recovery. So this is what I was saying earlier about we want to make sure we're pushing really hard in the session, but we also want to make sure we're not beating ourselves up. And there's that kind of fine balance. So you should be able to kind of see that you are able to increase weight over time. You're not feeling super beat up all the time. If you're having to deload every 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks, you're probably doing way too much or you're just not sleeping, or your diet is insufficient, or there's something going on, you should not have to deload every 3 or 4 weeks, in my opinion, because that means that you're wasting at least 25% of your training year deloading and not doing productive training. We want to make sure that we have more time between deloads so we can really start building momentum and pushing more and more and more. So this is where making sure that we're selecting the appropriate exercises, volumes, intensities to allow people to train for longer periods before deloading. Because if we're deloading every fourth week, 25% of our year is lost. If we can extend that out and say reduce it from 25% to maybe 10%, man, that's a whole lot more productive training time per year where we can really get stronger and get better results. So that's all the theory that I kind of wanted to cover for today. Let's get into the actual nitty gritty of what we're going to use in terms of progression strategies. So I want to say that these progression strategies are nothing super fancy. This is a non-exhaustive list. So if you do something or you've heard of something that's not listed on here, that's absolutely fine. These are just, I believe I give you seven different progression models that you can use that are effective. This is just to get you started. I also want to say that you shouldn't really pay too much attention to the number of sets or the total volume or some of the intensities. That's not necessarily the point. I want you to think of this as a concept. What is the main concept that we're trying to push here? So what's the main intention of these progression strategies? So I want you to know that you can manipulate the intensities, you can manipulate the sets, you can manipulate the reps, you can manipulate the frequency of implementation. All of this stuff is totally adaptable. These are just basics to kind of get you started and get you in the ballpark, and then you can adjust it based on the results you see in your own training, or if you're programming for other people, in the programming or in the results of your clients. Okay, so the first progression strategy is utilizing just a very basic set and rep strategy. So we're going to do 3 sets of 5 at 2 to 3 reps in reserve and adjusting the load. So what that means basically is if I do 3 sets of 5, every set of 5 that I do, fatigue is going to accumulate, which makes each subsequent set feel a little bit more difficult. So let's say I start out at, my first set of 5 feels like 3 reps in reserve once I rack the bar again. Well, okay, by the time I get to the third set, it might actually feel like 2 reps in reserve, or maybe even 1 rep in reserve. So what you're going to do to account for the increase in intensity of effort or perceived effort or relative effort is you're going to decrease the load accordingly. So, you're probably not going to get that much of a change just off of 3 sets, but if you're doing, let's say 5 or 6 sets of 5 or something like that, then yeah, you're probably going to start seeing that RIR climb all the way down to 1 or maybe even 0 if you're maintaining a static load. So what we can do to counteract this and make sure that we're maintaining the same level of relative intensity across all sets is we can adjust load downwards slightly to account for the increase in fatigue as sets go on. Like I said, across 3 sets, you're probably not going to see a big difference, but as you start going 4, 5, 6 sets plus, things like that, that's where you might see a pretty big change in intensity of effort or rate of perceived exertion, RPE, or RIR, which is essentially just the inverse of RPE. The next strategy is 3 by 5 at 2 to 3 RIR, but this time we're using a static load. So what this means is instead of adjusting the load down to make sure that we're always staying within that range, that means your first set is going to be about 2 to 3 RIR, but you're going to let the RIR drop, which means let's say your first set is a 3 RIR, second set is 3 RIR, maybe third set is 2 RIR, and if you're doing, let's say 5 sets, your fourth set might be a 2 RIR, and then your fifth set might be a 1 RIR. So it's perfectly fine for the RIR or the relative effort or relative intensity of climb because you're using a static load, and that's kind of part of the plan. So that's perfectly fine. And then as you get stronger using that same load, you might notice that you can actually maintain all of your sets while staying within that 2 to 3 RIR range. Okay, so that's also a good indication that you're getting a little bit stronger. The next strategy that we have here is utilizing a top set followed by some back off work. Okay, so we've got a top set of 5 at 2 reps in reserve, followed by some back off work. So 3 sets of 5 at 90% of your top set. Okay, so this allows us to get exposure to a little bit higher intensity. And then we do some back off work so we're not accumulating too much fatigue. Okay, so we're using a lower intensity. Now in this case, we're going to use an AMRAP on the last set. Now the reason why we'd use an AMRAP on the last set instead of the first set is because we're already going to be fatigued. So it's going to reduce the total number of reps that we can actually do. But it's going to allow us to push us to a very, very high level of effort because we're essentially going to be going till, like 0 reps in reserve on the last set. So it's going to somewhat limit the amount of fatigue that we can accumulate because we're already a little bit beat up. We're already a little bit tired from the subsequent or from the previous sets, but it's going to allow us to have kind of like a tester set. So let's say in week 1 on your last AMRAP set, maybe you get 8 repetitions. Well, maybe the next week you're going to try for 9 repetitions. Okay, so it's a nice little objective benchmark for you to kind of beat. So it can be kind of motivating, and it can be really good for like hypertrophy. It can be good for building up work capacity that's barbell specific. Let's say we're doing this on a bench press or maybe a high bar squat. I wouldn't do something like this for like a low bar squat or like a competition style deadlift, but you could definitely do it for, a variation. So if you're doing maybe a block pull, or if you're doing a high bar squat or a front squat, or something that's going to reduce the absolute load. So this can be a very, very effective strategy for that. Next, we have a 3x5 utilizing a 2 to 3 reps in reserve with a static load, but we're going to use an RIR cap. So what an RIR cap is, it means that once the RIR or the relative intensity reaches a certain level, then we're just going to call it there. Okay, so let's say, again, you're probably not going to get that much of a change in terms of relative intensity if we're only doing 3 sets, but let's say we're doing 5 sets. So your first set feels like a 3 RIR, second set, about a 2 or 3 RIR, third set is now a 2 RIR, fourth set, now that's about a 1 RIR. So you do your 5 reps and you say, you know what, I've only got 1 more rep in the tank, you rack it, and you still have 1 more set left, but you're going to call it quits there because you only got 1 more rep in the tank. Okay, so that's what an RIR cap means. It means we're capping the intensity once we reach a certain level of fatigue. Now, this can be very effective for managing fatigue and auto-regulating volume, because if you can't manage that and continue on without failing, then that means that's probably a good place for you to stop. Now, maybe we do two or 3 more weeks of this, and by week 3, you can actually complete all 5 sets of 5 while still staying within that RIR cap of 1. So that means we're probably getting a little stronger, we're probably improving our work capacity, we're probably gaining a little bit more muscle. So again, that's just another way to kind of auto-regulate your training. And again, it's a pretty easy way because we have an objective measure. Hey, I'm doing another set, or I'm doing more reps, or whatever it might be. Okay. The next strategy is utilizing a top single. Now, a lot of the times when people use a top single, it's kind of like an RPE 10, but it doesn't have to be. Right, so you can do a top single at an RIR of 2 or 3. It's going to be pretty heavy, but it's actually not that hard to recover from, believe it or not. Most people, in my experience anyways, can actually recover from higher intensity a little bit easier than they can recover from higher volumes. Now, some people are just better adapted to higher volumes. It also does depend on, your strength and a variety of different things. But generally speaking, most people can recover pretty well from a top single at 2 to 3 RIR. It's not really a big deal. So if we're doing something like that, that can be a fairly effective strategy for a lot of people. And then we get our back off work to increase the amount of total accumulative volume. So you're doing your top single, and then you're going to do some back off work, 3 sets of 8 at a static load at 2 reps in reserve. Okay, so again, we're getting exposure to higher intensity, and then we're getting some volume. Now, this can be a very effective strategy to use maybe a little bit further out from competition, because you're still getting exposure to higher intensities. In my experience, regardless of whether you're in season or off season, I think there is a good case to be made, and this definitely isn't the only way of doing things, but there is a good case to be made for keeping things specific year round. And you can change up what you're maintaining specificity through, whether it's exercise selection, intensity, or just a variety of different things. But I think there is a good case to maintain some exposure to a little bit heavier lifts. Because a top single at a 3 RIR, not super, super heavy, not super hard to recover from, but it's still going to keep your nervous system primed year round. So I do think that there is a good case for that. There's also a good case for other approaches, but this is one potential approach. Next, we have a top set of 5 at 2 reps in reserve, then 3 sets of 5 back off at 90% of your top set. Now, this is actually a strategy that I use fairly often with clients. I might add a pause in. So if I'm using this for squats, I might turn the back offs into a pause or even a long pause if I'm doing bench work. So top set might be, top set of 5 at 2 reps in reserve, just doing pause bench. And then the back off work, I might increase it to a 3-second pause to increase the relative effort. Okay, so that can be very effective as well. You don't have to add anything else in. You can also just keep it simple like that, 3x5 at 90% of the top set. You could do 92%, you could do 85%, you can do 95%, you can do whatever you want. These are just general figures to kind of get you in the ballpark. Feel free to manipulate them in any way that you see is going to be a better fit for you. Now, the last progression strategy is we're going to do a top set of 5 at 2 reps in reserve, and then we're going to do back off work, but at the same load. Now, the reason for this is because we're going to increase the exposure to higher intensities. Now, a top set of 5 at 2 RIR isn't, necessarily high intensity, but it's exposure to higher intensities than if you were to do some back off work at a lower weight. So we get more exposure to the top or heavier work. So again, we do a top set of 5 at 2 reps in reserve, and then we do some back offs, but we keep the load the same. So instead of dropping the load, this time we're going to drop the repetitions. So instead of doing sets of 5, we're going to do sets of 3. Okay, and this allows us to, like I said, maintain exposure to higher intensities, present a more robust neurological stimulus while still getting a little bit more volume to kind of build up muscle and preserve some muscle mass while still building up strength. So again, these are just 7 potential progression strategies that you can use. I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps in your own training. Feel free to send me any questions you might have if you want follow-ups or anything like that. But I hope that helps. Good luck in your training, and I'll see you on the next video.